Die Sprachübertragung beginnt jetzt. Alle Teilnehmer befinden sich im Zuhörermodus.
Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar today. We are very lucky to have some wonderful speakers here today for you, and we are touching a very hot topic, the US healthcare market. My name is Kirsten Hermann. I'm here representing Health Made in Germany, the expert initiative for the German healthcare industry. And with me, not exactly though, he is actually in San Francisco, is my colleague Heiko Steinacher. He is going to start with a presentation about the US healthcare market. Heiko has been working from San Francisco since 2018 and has been covering actually the healthcare industry and specifically the digital health segment since then quite intensely. So I'm very happy to have him here, of course, also with his political insight. Before San Francisco, Heiko was stationed also for Germany Trade and Invest in Warsaw and Stockholm. So he will give an overview of the US healthcare system with a specific focus on the effects of the Corona crisis. He will also point out some structural challenges of the market and some recent developments in the digital health segments. And of course, he will also give you an overview of resources Germany Trade and Invest provides on the US market. This will be followed by Mary McNamara. She's Senior Vice President, Regulatory Affairs at Alira Health. Alira Health is an international consulting firm with a specific focus on the healthcare industry as well. Mary has over 25 years of regulatory experience in the medical field. She has also recently worked closely with companies preparing emergency use authorizations and has participated on 2 COVID-19 national task force. So I'm also very happy that she has time to come here, both of them actually, because it's been quite hectic since last week's election. And Mary is actually going to touch on the highlights of medical device FDA regulations, the mentioned emergency use process, and how FDA is managing through the COVID-19 pandemic. This will be followed by a discussion, and you were probably missing already the political side of our seminar today. And we will start, the three of us, to give you a little overview of the political situation now after the election and the potential effects of the new administration on the US healthcare system. Just some quick information about Health Made in Germany. Health Made in Germany is the export initiative for the German healthcare industry. We are set up by the German federal government to support German companies from the healthcare field in their international activities. We are doing this in first place by providing information about healthcare markets worldwide. You can find this on our website for free. Those are market studies, webinars like today. We also have regulatory newsletters and online specials. We also support German companies in their marketing efforts abroad. We do this on like German pavilions at international trade fairs. We also publish promotional material, and German companies can use our logo Health Made in Germany for their promotional material. And we also provide platforms for networking at events, but also we host a company directory where German companies can be listed and therefore be visible for potential partners abroad. You can find all this information at www. for our German participants Exportinitiative Gesundheitswirtschaft.de, or for English www.healthmadeingermany.com. And yeah, now I'm very happy to pass on the mic to Heiko. Just one technical note, actually, before I do that. We are recording this webinar, so you will receive, of course, the link to this recording afterwards, as well as the presentations. We will start the discussion with a couple of questions on the political situation, but feel free to ask any questions anytime you are having this possibility, or you will be able to do that in the chat window. I'm sure all of you are meanwhile familiar to go to webinars. So yeah, and every question we don't answer, we will do afterwards. And now, Heiko, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. Let me just make sure to find the right buttons. Here we go. Here we go again. So now you should all be able to see my presentation. Is that correct? Hello?
Yes, it is.
That's fine. So first of all, a very warm welcome here from my side as well, from the US Pacific Coast, from San Francisco. Well, you all don't know that famous song, If You're Going to San Francisco. Well, if you do that nowadays, you won't see people with flowers in their hairs, but you will see persons in a very, very good mood. And I guess you can easily imagine why. We'll return to that topic later. First, let's turn to the healthcare market in the US, current situation. Well, Kirsten, I cannot start talking about the healthcare system the same way I did when we met last autumn for a webinar on e-health in the US within the framework of the export initiative you just introduced. Because as we all know, we had a major game changer this year, the Corona crisis. Well, at least in some respect, a temporary game changer at least, but in others also probably a lasting game changer. For example, when I think about telemedicine, a point I'll return to later. Another question, of course, is on how far the presidential is likely to affect healthcare, a point we will also return later to in our discussion, as you've already pointed out, Kirsten. Now, so I changed my agenda a little bit today, and before I turn to structural challenges, I want to give some introductory remarks from a medical device market perspective in the light of Corona. Yet this is really just introductory. We have Mary McNamara-Cullinane from Alira Health with us today. And Mary, as you've already pointed out, Kirsten, she's got many years of regulatory experience. So later we'll hear in much more detail about conditions, processes, Fda activities, and so on. So I will just touch that quickly. The COVID-19 outbreak led to a huge increase in demand for ventilators, protective equipment, test kits, chemicals for testing in the US, we all know that. And the FDA, that's the US Approval Authority, the Food and Drug Administration, has issued a number of these emergency use authorizations. These are authorizations for accelerated market access of urgently needed medical products now since the outbreak. I'm just mentioning this because it may be of particular relevance for foreign manufacturers, of course. So a lot of concepts for new such items, they came onto the market relatively quickly since. And on its website, the FDA provides information on these current special measures and, well, for both medical devices and drugs. And the FDA also has eased customs for certain medical products. It's not just concerns Chinese products, but, well, I really don't want to dive deeper into this right here. Of course, GTI, we do offer a lot more information on how the Corona crisis affects the movement of goods in the field of medical devices. I added a link here on the right side, which you can hardly see for the simple reason that it's written in blue letters on blue ground, not very perfect, but we're glad to provide you with this information after the webinar, of course, so you can have a more detailed look at these things. But let me take you back into the past a little, into a time before COVID-19 started raging around here. According to the latest figures of CDC, that's the Centers for Disease Control, an agency of the US Department of Health, Now, according to the latest CDC figures, US healthcare spending grew 4.6% in 2018, reaching $3.6 trillion. Now, is that much or not much? It is an awful lot, but you can see that only when you take it as a share of the nation's gross domestic product, this sums up to 17.7%. Now, in order to compare that, I added this chart here to the left. Well, that's OECD figures instead, but you can see that when it comes to cost in the healthcare system, the US are far beyond other countries and the OECD average. Now, there are many reasons for this, but just to mention a few. In the US, we have high prices for drugs, especially prescription drugs. Hospitalization, inpatient treatments becoming more and more expensive. Pharmaceutical companies, many of them manage to extend the patent term of their drugs at least once. And this keeps generic competition at a distance and costs high for longer than usual. And another thing which you can't see from the chart either is that it is also the private insurance system which makes healthcare so expensive in the US. Whereas Medicare, Medicaid, and other state programs, they cover so many people that they can demand lower prices from doctors and hospitals. Private insurance companies, they cover much fewer people, and each of them has to negotiate its own prices. And it's even worse for uninsured. Some hospitals charge uninsured patients for an ER visit 4 times as much as Medicare patients. Now, I didn't take this information for granted. 4 times I heard that. That's just someone told me, but this shows you the sorry for my expression, the craziness of this system. It's hard for us to understand. I mean, other countries like Germany, we have master price lists, but here in the US, the system is completely different. And owing to these high costs in healthcare, US hospitals have got enormous budgetary and spending constraints. Yet they are an important customer. Hospitals account for 1/3 of the costs in the US healthcare sector. And manufacturers of medical technology equipment, they can feel this cost pressure. So even before the outbreak of the Corona crisis, both medical service providers and cost units, they repeatedly urged them to cut prices. And now comes the Corona crisis. The large-scale outbreak has considerably exacerbated the problem of rising healthcare costs. At least we had, at the end of March, the CARES Act was passed, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief and Economic Security Act. And hospitals and other medical facilities, they have been granted, I think it was about $100 billion or something, which sounds an awful lot of money. But still, this is just in order to mitigate the consequences of the pandemic. It is not what we in Germany call a Konjunkturprogramm or something. It is really just to prevent the worst. And given all this, growth in the US medical device market will certainly be limited, at least in the very near future. Fitch, for example, predicts that the US medical device market will grow by an average of only 3.6% per year from 2019 to 2024. And that the market will not really recover until 2022. Iris World, a market research company, they only expect an average of 3% in this period. However, this is just overall. It's worth looking at segments. The outlook varies considerably from segment to segment. I mean, the main earning driver now is COVID-19 diagnostics, of course. We have this pandemic, but as soon as this pandemic is over, I would expect, especially treatments postponed during the pandemic now, cardiovascular, neurological diseases, obesity, that is acute and chronic diseases which are becoming more common as the population ages. They will probably rebound very quickly. In contrast to, well, dental, ophthalmic, orthopedic products, manufacturers of such products, they will certainly have to wait a little bit longer. And not surprisingly, now I'm changing the topic a little bit, turning to e-health. Not surprisingly, there's a strong market that is expected for e-health solutions in the US. Here on the left, unfortunately, that's only pre-COVID-19 projections. I don't have actual figures on that, sorry about that. Despite, or should I better say despite and because of the budgetary constraints we're facing here, there is a focus on increasing the efficiency of treatment and saving costs in the long term. Now, this is nothing that started long before the pandemic. So this process has been going on for a while, and there are particularly three things that can help to achieve this. First, the digitization of traditional processes like electronic medical records. Secondly, new technological developments like mobile internet and IoT. And thirdly, telemedicine. Now, there's a lot going on in all three of these areas, but I'll return to telemedicine later because there's really a lot going on there right now. So innovative technologies do play an important role in the US, but depending on which of these areas we're talking about, we will end up with a differentiated picture assessing the opportunities in the US market, especially from a German perspective. Now, why is that? In some areas, such as electronic patient files and big data applications, there's already strong competition among US manufacturers. So it's not easy for a German company to enter these markets. However, we can compete with innovative products, I would say, that are clinically relevant. That is, products that improve treatments themselves, digital medical devices. So what I mean is computed tomographs, blood glucose monitoring systems, pacemakers, these kind of products. Experts, however, also emphasize that in order to go down well in the US market, you must offer unique solutions for major problems. I'm touching marketing and distribution issues here, so especially a newcomer will certainly need advice on these issues to enter such a competitive market. And these new technologies, I'm specifically thinking of electronic medical records and that kind, they would need to be integrated into existing work processes. And one might not think of that when talking about the US, but still, data interfaces are a problem here. So individual systems, they often work poorly or together, or they're not interlinked at all. Doctors, clinics and pharmacies, they work on different technological levels. As far as I know, there's neither a national platform for data exchange nor a data interface for patients. However, it seems that Corona is speeding up these processes quite a lot now. A nationwide federal system, the eHealth Exchange, is developing fast. And moreover, the user behavior has started changing drastically already before the outbreak of Corona. A good example is Apple's Health Record app, I think. This feature, Apple launched it already in March 2018, and it allows users to save their medical records on an iPhone. I don't know how many clinics participate in the meantime, but certainly a lot do so. And Apple has entered into several cooperations, for example, with the US Department of Veteran Affairs. So the app could get millions of users at a stroke. Now that's a really big market. And Amazon and Google, they've started steering up this market as well. So I entered the tech scene now and the tech giants, and I don't know, to be honest, how deep we should dive into the tech scene, but maybe that much. Large tech companies, they push innovation. They have been pushing innovation in the healthcare sector for a couple of years now, and they often do so in cooperation with startups. And this is really not just about apps, smartwatches, or fitness trackers, but also, for example, health data storage, like this example with Apple I just mentioned shows. And currently, AI, artificial intelligence algorithms do play a very important role to track COVID-19 cases and for many, many other things as well. So AI is not just depending on COVID, of course. Not so long ago, we talked about the founder scene together with AHK, USA San Francisco, the GACC West. We had someone in our round who knows, Andreas Hoffmann, the head of the German Accelerator Silicon Valley program. So instead of talking here, we recorded that. And if you're interested in these issues, we are very glad to provide you with a link, of course. A point I would like to return to at the end of my speech is telemedicine, because there are really good prospects in this special market. Thanks to the policy of social distancing in hospitals and clinics, telemedicine has recently received a really great boost. And surveys indicate that we're talking about a lasting change here. A clear majority of US users of telemedical services, they express a high level of satisfaction. So many patients may therefore want to use these services again after the pandemic. And it seems likely that the willingness to use other digital healthcare solutions will also grow. That is, whereas now it is video chats with doctors that are booming during the Corona crisis, in future there will be other applications such as digital therapeutics, remote monitoring, software as a medical device. They will probably provide the impetus for the development of further platforms. And just to give you an idea how big this market is likely to be, Ariston, that's another market research company, they predicted just after the outbreak of Corona here in the US, that the US market for telemedicine would grow around 78% in 2020 to $9.5 billion, and by an average of nearly 30% per year till 2025. Now, Kirsten, I think I have exhausted my time frame. I hope, of course, we're still on good track. But before I give the floor to Mary, just some final remarks on internet specials we have currently released. We have currently launched. We got one on digital health, where you can read a lot more things that I can only touch here in these couple of minutes on these issues. We have country reports on that in German language, of course. We also recently launched a special on the US election with background information through the eyes of German entrepreneurs, what they can expect from the elections. And we have a special on coronavirus, special effects, special issues that relate developments in foreign markets. So that's it, basically. I would say thank you very much for your attention, and I would give the floor to Mary.
Thank you, Heiko. This was a very good start, and I look forward talking to you again afterwards. And yeah, Mary, the floor is yours, and then we will start our discussion afterwards.
Thank you. And can you see my screen okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for having me here today. I'm pleased to be able to speak to you about a general overview of the USA FDA regulations, as well as the mechanisms by which FDA is using to expedite sort of technologies and treatments to address the COVID-19 pandemic. So my first slide here just talks about the setup of the FDA. What are the different entities that regulate all of the products that are approved here in the United States? There's basically, there's many organizations within the FDA, but there's really three organizations that are focused on medical products. The first is CDER, which is the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, and they manage over-the-counter prescription device drugs, biologic therapeutics, and also generics. CBER, the Center for Biological Evaluation and Research, that's the group within FDA that regulates biological products, cellular products, gene products, allergenics, vaccines, which are very important today, as well as tissues and blood therapies. And then CDRH, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, and this is where I've spent the majority of my career, is the group at FDA that reviews devices and in vitro diagnostics and anything having to do with radiological products. And as you can see on the left hand of the screen here, the other centers at FDA that are here regulate things like food safety, tobacco products, veterinary medicine, and then there are specific centers that will review oncology, cancer type products, clinical policies, external affairs, and so on. So there are many groups within the FDA, but today we're going to mostly focus on CDRH. Okay, so there are several pathways to get a medical device or a surgical technology or a digital health product through the FDA. One of them is called the 510K pre-market notification process. This is the most common process that's utilized within the FDA organization. And what a 510K is a submission for a device that there is something else on the market out there like it that has already gone through the 510K process. So it must have something that's called a predicate device. And so you would submit your 510K based on somebody else's previously cleared device. The risk-based classification scheme is such that Class 1 devices are the least risky. Class 2 devices have a moderate level of risk, and Class 3 have a major level of risk. Most Class 2 devices fall under this 510K process. Typically, clinical data is not required in a 510K. The bulk of the evidence provided to FDA in a 510K submission is just that comparison with the predicate. Are the indications for use the same? Is the technology similar? That is the bulk of the evidence provided in a 510K. And as I said, very few 510Ks require clinical data. The next submission is called a de novo 510K, and this is relatively new, just in the last 10 to 15 years at FDA. And what a de novo 510K is, it's a submission to the FDA for a novel product, so something that doesn't have a clear predicate, which is what you need in the traditional 510K. So it's a novel device for which there's no clear predicate, but what is considered low to moderate risk product. And those kinds of products fall into the de novo 510K process. A good amount of scientific evidence, preclinical and animal testing are typically needed to support a de novo, and many times clinical data is required with a de novo 510K. In the risk level for, as I said, for de novo 510Ks fall within a Class 2 device risk classification, and they're, as I said, low to moderate risk type products. The next on the screen in the gray is the humanitarian device exemption submission. And what that is it's a submission to the FDA for a product that's intended to treat a rare disease, diagnose or treat a rare disease that affects less than 8,000 people per year in the United States. Class 1 and Class 2 devices can fall under this humanitarian device exemption status, and a good amount of scientific evidence as well as clinical trial data are required to get an HDE approved through the US. And then lastly, on the very right side is the PMA process. It's a pre-market approval. It's for the highest risk devices, Class 3 devices. Extensive level of scientific evidence is required, including clinical trials, preclinical, and animal studies. Some examples of Class 1 devices would be an electric toothbrush, very, very low risk, an oxygen mask, bandages, and things like that. Class 2 device examples would be a blood pressure cuff, absorbable sutures, syringes, contact lenses. A lot of wound care products fall under Class 2. And then Class 3, again, that highest risk. Examples would be breast implants, pacemakers, defibrillators, artificial cartilage knee implants, as well as drug-eluting stents falling under Class 3. And this schematic really just shows, again, where the different classes fall. So Class 1, typically, a lot of Class 1 devices are exempt from 510K, meaning no 510K is required. And then, as I said, Class 2, moderate to controlled risk. Typically, devices at that risk level fall into 510K and de novo 510K. And then the Class 3 devices are the highest risk, and those require PMAs. In the general controls, the special controls, and the clinical data, what those refer to are all of the classes need general controls, which mean you have to register your facility and just list your device on an FDA website. That's the general control, and all devices have to comply with that. Special controls are other types of guidances that FDA publishes that you must comply with, as well as any other performance testing according to international standards. And then clinical data is typically required for PMA devices, HDE devices, and then some de novos, and it's very rare to have a 510K requiring clinical data. So that's what those controls are referring to. And then lastly, just wrapping up my general overview for FDA regulations. These are just some tips on what to avoid and what are common mistakes that are made in the regulatory strategy journey to FDA approval. So there's one submission I didn't speak about, which is called the pre-submission. The pre-submission is a submission that's prior to getting to the 510K or de novo or PMA stage. A pre-submission is provided to FDA early on in research and development to introduce FDA to your product or your technology, to provide them with information on testing you've done to support the intended use, any performance testing, and then what your test plan is. It's a very valuable document to get FDA's feedback before you conduct expensive and time-consuming testing. So some common mistakes are, again, not planning or having a regulatory strategy or pathway, not doing your due diligence in terms of researching what is the classification of this product and what is the pathway forward. Is it a 510K? Is it a novel product that just falls into de novo? And again, not communicating with FDA early on in the process. Again, that pre-submission process is very valuable, and it's a tool that I highly recommend utilizing if there are any questions in the classification of your system. Another mistake can be performing extensive testing prior to communicating with FDA. You don't want to complete animal studies that FDA are going to object to what was done in that animal study and require you to repeat it. So again, that early pre-submission process is valuable in communicating that information. Not submitting a pre-sub can be a very big mistake, again, because you're not going to get that early feedback before you move on to your submission stage. Not understanding the history of the device, just get on the FDA website, do a search to see the classification and similar products. If there's an FDA guidance document that's applicable for your technology or your device, you need to follow that. And then when we do have FDA meetings, not being prepared is a big mistake, because we want to be prepared before we present to FDA about any technology or submission. And then after you have an FDA submission, you want to make sure that you take their advice seriously and incorporate it into your eventual 510K or de novo 510K. So those are just some common mistakes and tips on the regulatory strategy journey. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to COVID-19 and what has FDA done to expedite technologies and digital technologies and treatments to address the pandemic. So there are two mechanisms by which companies can get their products on the market through the FDA to address the COVID-19 pandemic. One is through something called an emergency use authorization process. It's a submission process where you supply FDA with a submission that has a description, indication, and testing to support the safety and efficacy of the device, as well as the applicability to the COVID-19 pandemic population. And this process is similar to a 510K process, except for it's expedited with FDA, and it's an interactive process. The next mechanism is called an exercising enforcement discretion through immediately in effect guidance documents. That's a long phrase to basically say FDA has released several guidance documents for devices and systems that are available to address the COVID-19 pandemic. So devices such as ventilators, face masks, respirators, disinfectants, diagnostics, most of these can go right to market if they comply with the FDA guidance document. So those are the two mechanisms by which we can obtain FDA approval for a technology to address COVID-19. The emergency use authorization process has several stipulations or conditions. One is that we must provide fact sheets in the emergency use authorization submission. Those fact sheets tell the user that this product is novel, it's not approved on the market yet, but it's only gone through this emergency use authorization process. Risks and benefits must be described in those fact sheets, alternatives. The EUAs, the emergency use authorizations, they have limited testing requirements. There are some limitations that FDA enforces. And then companies are required to monitor and report adverse events. And then there are some limitations, again, because these products are only approved through the EUA process. And if a company gets a technology or device approved through an EUA, that is rescinded once the public health emergency has been declared over. This graphic just shows the process. First, FDA and the government had to declare a public health emergency. Then a pre-EUA submission can be sent to FDA and it's assigned a pre-EUA number and it goes through a screening process. Once it goes through that screening process, it then moves on to the formal EUA process. FDA will either approve or reject that EUA. And again, as I said, the EUA is terminated once the public health emergency is over. And then for in vitro diagnostics, again, it's a similar pathway to other technologies, except for one thing. So in vitro diagnostic to address COVID-19, there's a template available on the FDA website for the EUA, and companies must follow that template. The difference between other technologies is if there is a company that's going to, has a diagnostic that's going to address COVID-19, that company can actually go to market with their diagnostic before they submit their emergency use authorization to the FDA. But the EUA has to be submitted within a 15 business day period. Okay, so manufacturers of diagnostics can go right to market, but they must submit their EUA submission to FDA within 15 days. And then as of October 6th, laboratory developed tests have a couple of different requirements than the EUA. So FDA wants to see some information for laboratory developed tests. However, no EUA is required as of that October date. There are strict regulations and limitations according to different states in the United States. However, again, you know, there's no EUA required, but those tests must be developed under the legal authority of the states for which the laboratory resides for that laboratory developed test. So quickly, I'll go through some highlights of FDA activities. As of, I believe, yesterday, FDA had approved 288 diagnostic tests. 223 of those are molecular, 58 antibody, and 7 antigen tests. They are actively monitoring the food supply and other types of products coming into the U.S. to address COVID-19. There's a good availability of many of these products that have been approved from the emergency use authorization. There are several hundred drug development programs in process going through FDA stages. And they are currently reviewing over 270 trials for treatments to address COVID-19. And there is quite a bit of fraudulent activity. I'm sure many of you have seen this yourself. There's a lot of internet products available on the internet that say they address COVID-19, like different hand sanitizers and disinfectants. The FDA has identified over 1,000 fraudulent products, and they are continuing to monitor that situation. And again, some more recent updates and activities. In August, FDA approved an EUA for convalescent plasma, although I know the clinical data for that is really questionable at the moment, but they have approved an EUA for using convalescent plasma. They broadened the scope of the use of remdesivir to treat hospitalized patients with COVID. That was in August. In September, they issued a guidance document for clinical trials for patients, for any clinical trial for patients and products that are being used and conducted during the COVID pandemic. In October, FDA approved 2 generic drugs to help with tracheal intubation during mechanical ventilation. And they also held a public meeting to discuss the vaccine development. And just in the last few days in November, FDA has approved an EUA for monoclonal antibody therapy to treat mild to moderate COVID-19 patients. They also authorized the first test that detects neutralizing antibodies from recent or prior infections. And that's really about all that I have here. And also a couple of other initiatives FDA has gone through is they have developed educational materials that will help for all cultures and ethnicities to understand COVID-19. FDA wants to make sure that all of the Americans are informed of what is available to them during the COVID-19 pandemic. And then lastly, there is still a shortage of personal protective equipment, testing supplies, and ventilator-related devices in the United States. And then this is my last slide. And this is one of the best practices. Which pathway should you utilize if you have a technology or a device intended for COVID? So if you decided to go for the EUA pathway, there's numerous guidance documents and templates on the FDA website. I encourage you to utilize that. Communication up front with FDA is very important. I recommend emailing FDA to let them know that you're planning on submitting an EUA, and they will provide you with additional information on the information needed. The EUA process, FDA does compromise on safety and efficacy. So compared to a traditional 510K, there'll be a lesser burden of evidence needed for the EUA, but they will want to see some level of safety and efficacy data. A company gets to gain clinical experience with their product if they get an EUA approved. And that will help you in the long run once you do try to go for a traditional 510K or de novo, because then FDA is familiar with your product because it's already gone through this emergency use authorization process. And then for the benefits for the traditional pathway are that clearance is permanent, so there's no rescindance of your EUA. If you get a 510K approved for a COVID-related product, clearance is permanent, but you must comply with all data requirements, and will be a higher level of evidence needed for that product. And if you go the traditional pathway, 510K or de novo, your product can still be used for COVID patients, and again, you have permanent clearance or approval through the FDA. So these are my tips on the best practices for whether or not you should go through an EUA process or a traditional 510K de novo or PMA pathway. And I thank you for listening, and I look forward to our question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. And Heiko, I'm very happy to have you in our round again. Yeah, this was a very helpful overview. And I already received a couple of questions, especially for Mary. And I encourage everyone to ask more. We can answer it afterwards. And also feel free to email us any questions afterwards as well. But as we mentioned before, and now I just noticed there was one thing missing, my camera. Yeah, we would like to return to the presidential election, which we didn't really touch on your presentations yet, because it's a little bit more of a discussion issue right now. Not the results, but maybe the effects. And I would actually like to ask you, yeah, what you think, how the new President Biden will maybe affect the U.S. healthcare system. And since Mary just spoke about regulatory issues and FDA, maybe she can start with an answer on maybe this perspective, and then Heiko can speak a little bit more of the overview healthcare system.
Sure. So I don't expect any major changes coming out of the FDA from this transition from a Trump administration to a Biden administration. What FDA has shown in the last several months is they've been very effective in their commitment to protecting public health. They have expedited and worked very effectively to gain approvals for drugs and devices and different technologies to address COVID-19. The last thing I'll say is, depending on what happens with the control of the Senate, because that is still not completely called yet. If the control of the Senate does end up being in the Democratic hands, there may be an expansion of our healthcare coverage. But I can't predict that just yet. It's going to depend on the outcome of the election in Georgia.
Okay, thank you, Mary. Heiko, what do you think?
Kirsten, it's a bit of $1 million question, to be honest. I think of basically 3 points in this context, and the first two quite interesting. Trump and Biden, they don't differ much on their opinions when it comes to those. First thing, both of them want to bring back drug supply chains into the US. Trump, for example, he already instructed government agencies in August to purchase so-called essential medicines only from US manufacturers. I think it was the day before yesterday or 3 days ago, the FDA published this list, and our colleague Susanne Scholl in our customs department, she also wrote about that. Biden has the same aim, but somewhat different ideas. He wants to introduce tax incentives, but still it's the same goal, bring back drug supply chains to the US. So this is definitely something we can expect to continue. Another thing both have in mind are the high prices, especially for prescription drugs, which I mentioned at the very beginning. Now, Trump had his own methods to deal with that, and Biden, he thinks about price caps for certain drugs. So, but this kind of policy, the aim is still the same: cut prices, get the prices down, especially for high prescription drugs. And the third thing, which has to do with this $1 million question I mentioned at the beginning, Mary talked about that already, and that's the social healthcare system. And in that respect, they couldn't differ much more. Whereas Trump, he would like to get rid of Obamacare completely, the Affordable Care Act introduced under Obama years ago. Biden wants to expand it to the so-called Biden Care. Now, there's a couple of things to say about that. First of all, there are some legally controversial issues related to this Biden Care, and the Supreme Court 2 days ago argued that it is just individual elements. So it's not the whole Obamacare, it's not the whole act that is legally controversial. So from that point of view, the Supreme Court will likely not overturn this entire reform, which means that in theory, Biden could carry on with his plans, in theory. Well, then comes into play what Mary just mentioned. We will probably miss lack of unity in Congress. If Republicans get the majority again in the Senate, it will be difficult to get such a bill passed. And apart from that, we also must not underestimate the political power of the US hospitals. And they are certainly not amused of Biden's plans. I mean, one of the points is that there should be a choice option for quite a big group of people. I don't want to get too much in detail, but Biden's plans could lead to a situation where 15 to 20, some people guess even more, might join this system. And if those millions of people were all to get Medicare, I mentioned that also at the beginning, that the state organizations and private companies, they have to negotiate different prices with doctors and hospitals. Now, if millions of people more join the system, hospitals, they will get much less in revenue. So they're certainly not very much in favor of these plans. If Biden, however, somehow gets through his plans, I would expect that many US citizens might then decide for more preventive health. So that's a view through the glasses of a medical device manufacturer. That's a market that is still that is sleeping at present, I would say, because that was even before the outbreak of Corona, that less people did such medical checkups simply because the premiums were high, the deductibles were high, and so people, they stayed at home and they went only to a doctor when it wasn't avoidable anymore. So now if more people got insurance or covered by state aid, there would certainly be a lot be happening on this market. So, but the likelihood at this moment, rather not. That's all we can probably say to this at the moment.
Thank you, Heiko. I actually read something you wrote today about that, which I thought was really interesting, starting with the pharmaceuticals and the reshoring. Yeah, which brings us actually back to Corona, the other biggest challenge of the country and worldwide this year. And besides the presidential election, Heiko, we received a question, I actually also from a startup company here. You said how important the scene, the startup scene is, especially for digital health and the environment there in San Francisco. I'm sure this has changed now too. I mean, you read about everyone fleeing the city, and of course also your natural catastrophes this summer, and how. Was there an effect of Corona there, especially for German founders and German startups who are active there or like to be active?
Yes, Kirsten, there was and there still is. I mean, let me start like this. I mean, we know Corona is a challenge for the startup scene. Because startups in normal times, they depend on the personal contact to venture capitalists, other startup teams and all that. So the good news is that the setback for the founder scene that many people feared by Corona didn't really materialize. So if we look at the startup scene, even without state aid, many startups are apparently still very well financed. And we had quite a lot of successful IPOs on the New York Stock Exchange in the last few weeks, and there will be more. And so the overall situation looks quite good. Through the glasses of a German startup, I would say, a few months ago, it seemed as if the US really lost a little bit of its appeal for German startups due to the outbreak of COVID, because at the beginning, it was such that, especially in early startup phases, it was hard to attract venture capital. Venture capitalists, they concentrated largely on their portfolios in order to get their existing investments safely through the crisis. But I recently talked to Andreas Hoffmann from the German Accelerator Silicon Valley program about that, and he says that this has fundamentally changed again in the last 2 to 3 months. Because technology is the clear winner of the crisis, and companies are now invested massively in digitization, and that benefits startups in all financing phases. And so many companies are still considering how they can expand into the US, and the accelerator here, for example, they work together with a lot of German companies from really, they come from all areas, and health technology is an important area, of course, but Corona led to a situation where really in many areas new applications are in high demand. Health technology is just one of them. EdTech, education technology is another. FinTech, logistics, e-commerce. So when it comes to healthcare, that's also, I also already mentioned that, especially in telemedicine, there's a really great potential opening up right now. And artificial intelligence is, of course, another thing, not just in healthcare, but especially in healthcare. There's a lot of applications, and there's a lot going on there in this respect. And it was just before the outbreak of COVID, I spoke to a startup entrepreneur in Vienna, Richard Liuar. He's the CEO of a Vienna-based AI startup. and they had their FDA approval for their product in November 2019. It's not enough time to talk about that, but now we're talking about this. I can gladly send you a link to this. I wrote an article for our magazine, Markets International, this summer, and he also has a lot of experience with the FDA, and this is from an AI angle. So this is quite interesting. So he compared the FDA when it comes to approval of an AI compared to its European counterparts. But it's a specific topic, of course.
Okay, thank you, Heiko. Okay, we had some political questions now. I think we should return to the regulatory issues, just to be fair here on the speaking parts and also to our participants. You were talking about, high demand and for digital health solutions. And I mean, FDA is trying to face the strong demand by emergency use authorizations. So Mary, we had one question which actually just asked how long does it take for an approval for an emergency use authorization?
Sure. So I have gotten a couple approved. It took about 12 weeks for one of them and about 8 weeks for another. So it's not that, I mean, it's abbreviated compared to a traditional submission, but FDA still does a thorough review and make sure that there's enough safety and efficacy data in there to get an approval. So I would say you can count on, a 1 to 3 month period to get an EUA approved.
Okay, well, that's actually timely. Another question regarding the EUA. I think you answered it, but I just want to make sure that we get it clear. Once the pandemic is over, what happens to the device that has been approved by the EUA? Is it approved forever, or does it have to go through another process again?
Right. So if you get an EUA approval, once the public health emergency is declared over by Health and Human Services in the United States, that approval is rescinded, meaning you can no longer commercialize that device. So companies will have some period of time to make sure that they get all their devices back from the clinical sites, from the hospitals and clinics, and then they would have to go through a traditional approval process, whether that's the 510K or de novo, depends on the level of risk of the product.
Okay, yeah, that's what I thought. I just wanted to make sure. And I know this is not going to be an easy answer, and I think this is going to be the last one because it's all about money. We received a question about the general costs for an FDA approval and maybe additional procedures you have to apply to or get registered somewhere in order to access the US market. I'm sure this is a little harder to give a short answer.
So for the emergency use authorization, there are no fees involved, right? So companies can just get through FDA without paying a fee. For a traditional 510K, the cost is about $12,000 for FDA to review that. For a de novo 510K, it's around $110,000 for FDA to review a de novo 510K. For a PMA, it's several $100,000. It's probably close to $1 million. But there is a mechanism by which you can get a reduced fee if you are a small business. So there's a small business qualification submission or application you can send to FDA, and you have to include tax receipts and things like that. And it's also open to foreign companies as well. And if you make less than, I'm not even sure what the number is, I think if you make less than $1 million or a couple of $1 million a year, you may qualify for the small business designation, and then those fees are all reduced. So then the 510K might be $3,000, the de novo might be $10,000, and then the PMA is significantly less than normal. And then the other fees you need to be aware of are every company has to register with FDA and pays a couple of $1,000s just to register every year. So that's another fee that is involved with the medical device commercialization.
Is there like a place where you can find all this information? Or is it actually the best way, as you said, to contact FDA, talk to them, and receive the information from them?
You can find all of this on the FDA website. You can look under user fees, and you'll see, and there are links to the small business qualification application.
Mm-hmm. Well, very helpful. Thank you, Mary. It is already 2 minutes past 5 here, at least, and I would like to stay on time, but I would also like to maybe give both of you just one last statement, and before we all go our ways, yeah, is there anything? Maybe what did you do on election night?
On election night, I didn't watch television. I wanted to wait until it was all over. So, but if anybody has any questions or needs any assistance, my contact information is on the slides, and I'm happy to help anybody answer any questions to going through the FDA process or the EUA process. Please reach out. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
Basically the same I would like to say. There's a lot of more things I would have liked to say, but I mean, we're running out of time. There's actually a lot we published on the healthcare sector, so I really invite you all to have a look at our webpage and take a closer look at some issues. When it comes to the election, that's also something, that's maybe a final word from my side. There's a lot of question I received in the last couple of days from German enterprise, from associations, and so on. And this is all, there are really high expectations at this moment, and one really must be, as we say in Germany, we should stay on the ground. We should leave the church in the village. You can't translate that to English probably that way, but I think you understand what I mean. We have a newly elected president, yet we also have a highly divided country. We must see that, and this reflects in Congress, and Biden, he will need the support for many of his projects from the Senate, or yeah, and I mean the future will show how his plans will materialize, how this will go on, but a lot of problems will face difficulties, and we will not have a change from one day to another when it comes to trade policy issues and all that. We would have to look really in detail, and yeah, I don't want to say people should not expect anything. I just telling we must stay realistic about what is likely to happen.
Yeah, I guess that's a wise thing to say. Thank you, both of you, and thank you, everyone, for staying with us, for listening to us. And I'm sure you will be hearing more in the next months because things will be changing at some point, or maybe not. We will unfortunately still have Corona with us, and but also very exciting new developments, like maybe a vaccine that is supposed to be actually regulated or in the US, as I heard. Anyways, thank you, everyone. We will send you the link to everything and the presentations tomorrow or next week. And feel free to contact us directly for questions. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
And stay healthy.
Mm-hmm.